The Mishcon Academy Digital Sessions.
Hello there, and welcome to Mishcon's Academy Talks. I'm Jo Rickards, and my guest today is Andy Coulson. So thanks so much for coming, Andy.
Oh, thanks for asking.
You and I met nearly 10 years ago now, which is unbelievable, when you had your very own, very public crisis arising out of the phone hacking case at the News of the World. You stood trial twice, once in England and then in Scotland. And now you run your own advisory business, Coulson Partners, and you specialize in helping leaders to kind of run their business and meet challenges as they come along. And so I want to explore today kind of how your own crisis has shaped you and how you've kind of turned it around and got to the place that you are at today. So can you give us a kind of thumbnail sketch leading up to the point when you and I met, kind of your history and background?
I started as a trainee journalist on my local paper at 20. I then went and worked, got myself some shifts, and I went to work on Fleet Street on the Sun. And then, from there it was, a fantastic decade actually. I made some terrific mistakes, and I'm sure we'll get into that. Mistakes for which I'm extremely sorry. But I can't, not tell the truth about my newspaper career. And that decade, my 20s, were terrifically exciting. I wasn't a political journalist. I was a showbiz journalist, and I had my own column. And that was in the days when, record companies and film companies would fly you around the world to interview, whoever their star was in that given week. That's essentially what I did for a decade. And then I moved from being a reporter, if you like, to being an executive at The Sun. I was the number 3 at The Sun for a number of years. The Sun's where I spent most of my newspaper career. Then I had a brief period working on the internet for Rupert Murdoch, setting up the websites, and they asked me to become the deputy editor of the News of the World. And that is a sliding door. That turned out to be a pretty dramatic sliding door moment for me. And so then I went to the News of the World as the deputy. And then I became the editor in 2003, and I was the editor for 4 years. And then, as you know, I spent the next sort of 6 months after I resigned from the News of the World. I then spent sort of 6 months wondering what I was going to do next. Thought maybe I'd go back to newspapers, but in America. And then I found myself in some conversations with the Conservative Party. And the more I talked to them, and I talked to them for quite some time, I decided actually this is a really interesting thing to do. And then I went into politics. I joined in the sort of spring of 2007. We didn't know when the election was going to be until finally we got to the election in 2010. So we were in a constant sort of campaigning state. And then, we just about got over the line, not with a majority, but into a coalition. And then I found myself, running a government communications department, establishing a government communications department that was across 2 parties. So the people that I've been effectively competing against, from the Lib Dems, were part of the team, and that was a fascinating challenge in and of itself. Yeah. And then, that led, there've been a number of resignations, as you know, Jo, and then that led in 2011 to my resigning. And that kind of coincided with the kind of build-up, didn't it? The sort of slow murmur of the investigation and then legal proceedings and all the rest of it. Yeah, and that kind of started in a sort of towards the end of 2010. Yeah. Yeah, and that essentially is why I resigned. Yeah. I said at the time that when the spokesman needs a spokesman, it's a bit of a clue that it's time to move on, and that's how I felt. That's actually how I, in a different way, that's how I felt about the News of the World as well, because I was, I was the editor of a red top newspaper that had, views, particularly around law and order. And I just felt in 2007, when my royal reporter had been convicted and sent to prison, that, my position was untenable. I maintained that I didn't break the law. But I made a load of mistakes as an editor, some terrible misjudgments. And, I honestly felt I should pay a price for that, and I did. And I effectively put an end to my newspaper career. Yeah.
And how did you cope with, because you had such a stratospheric rise, you know, you were going right up and then all of a sudden you're a bit like, you know, a COVID spike. You're right down again after lockdown, but you've got to sort of deal with that. And how did you find the resilience to deal with that? Because we had a long stretch of time in front of us where we knew this case was going to take years.
Yeah. Well, it took me a little while to get my head around it, but I was able, you know, largely because of the, you know, support of my wife and my kids and an amazing group of friends, many of whom owed me absolutely nothing, who kind of, you know, stuck with me. That is the single most important thing. But put that to one side for the purposes of this conversation. What I was able to do pretty quickly was, you know, understand what was happening to me. And that sounds a fairly obvious thing to do, but often when you are facing, you know, a challenge, that can take some time. The second thing I was able to get to, and this, you know, took longer and is an ongoing process, you've got to understand what you have control of and what you don't have control of. And obviously my reputation was, you know, damaged, let's put it mildly. And getting to a point where you can say to yourself, you know, what people think of you, whatever you think the truth is of yourself, and I'm very clear on what my truth is, if you like, you know, that's all well and good, but you've got to be able to let other people have their opinions and not let it kind of get inside. And that's really hard.
That must be hard, yeah.
It's a difficult thing to do, but it's absolutely critical.
We get to the end of the first trial at the Old Bailey with all the kind of theatre that involves, and of course it went the wrong way for us. And you ended up going to prison.
Yeah.
Packing a bag full of stuff that then they wouldn't let you take in. And being in the van, going out to Belmarsh. How was that? Was that scary?
Yeah, I mean, it was obviously daunting, and I was obviously, you know, pretty anxious. I had a lot of time to think about it. You know, I did a lot of reading about prison. I did a lot of kind of research on it. Most of that turned out to be entirely wrong, not least the kind of what can you take in and what will life be like. But it was, I think, partly because I'm a journalist by trade. You know, I found parts of it fascinating. You know, to be in that situation with, you know, a lot of other men who were, for a whole range of different reasons, in the same place at the same moment, experiencing the same thing, on one level was fascinating. And also I was seeing a system that I'd kind of been involved with, albeit only from a communications, not a policy point of view, but from a communications point of view, from the other side of the fence, to suddenly find yourself in the midst of it was at times fascinating. But fascinating is not the word I would use to describe prison. It was mind-numbingly dull. There was very little education, there was very little work, there was very little of anything outside of your cell. So I would, you know, more often than not, you'd be spending, you know, 20 hours plus, you know, behind the door. And obviously there was the kind of, at Belmarsh, there was a sort of running theme of when am I going to be moved to a DCAT prison. And that was, as you remember, a very long, sort of fairly frustrating process.
But that was a lot better by the time you got there, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's a totally different regime. And the governor there sat me down on the day I arrived, and he said, look, you know, you're going to be here for, I think it was just over 2.5 months, and we're going to put you to work. I was at a prison called Hoseley Bay on the Suffolk coast, and it's a resettlement prison. So it's preparing people for, you know, for re-engagement. And so I was working in the resettlement department as an orderly, and that meant that I was interviewing on a daily basis other inmates and helping them with their CVs and, you know, doing Dragon's Den presentations. It was a really rewarding and quite fascinating job. So Hoseley Bay was a completely different experience, but it was still prison. Yeah. And I was still separated from my family. And, you know, anyone who says that prison, DCAT or otherwise, is a sort of holiday camp experience, I can tell you it absolutely isn't.
Yeah. And then, so you got through all of that process, came out of Hoseley Bay, and then still had the Scottish trial to contend with. It was a kind of never-ending roller coaster of trials for you.
I came out of prison in November 2014, and then the trial in Scotland, that started, I think, in the May of the following year. So I was on a tag sort of in between times, and then I came off the tag and then immediately went into another trial. So that was, that was quite difficult.
The big thing that I get from talking to you now, though, is, and at the time actually, I mean, you're just not at all bitter. I mean, you obviously have regrets, but you haven't let it turn you into a bitter person. No,
well, I think there's obviously a fundamental difference between regret and bitterness, and I deeply regret, so much of it. But I've tried to stay positive. I can't say that's been a daily success for me. I've had some, pretty dark days. And every bitter day that I've had, and I've had a few, I've always felt worse the following day. You really have got to stay out of that. I've managed to do that, but you got to, you need help with that.
Yeah.
I've had, as I've said already, tremendous help from, my family and my friends, but I've also had professional help as well. And I'm a great believer in it, and it's been enormously beneficial for me and continues to be.
Right. No, I'm a believer in it too. I think it's really helpful for people. So you came out, and lots of people would have thought, right, how do I reestablish myself? I'll publish a book. And you've never done that. You decided instead to start a business.
I was the editor of the News of the World for 4 years, spent 5 years talking about it, through that negative prism that I talked about earlier. If I'd written a book and gone off and do it, I'd have to, what's that, another year?
Yeah.
Of picking through it all, entirely negative. And I just wanted to do something positive. And my plan was always to start a business. So that's what I decided to do. And so the business is now, I started in January 2016, and we're going pretty well. I'm working with some brilliant people. We've got some fantastic clients, and I'm very glad I made that decision.
And have you found your history to kind of be beneficial to clients, or has it put clients off, or is it a bit of both?
Well, if it puts them off, you never find out, because of course they don't work with you, so it's pretty efficient. I'm sure there are. I'm sure that there are, and I'm sure that there have been. But you've got to understand what you have control of and what you don't have control of. And I don't have control of what other people think of me at all. And if there are other people who look at me and my story and the offer that I have in my business and think that's not for me, then they're well within their rights to reach that conclusion. So, but when I do get an opportunity, and when it is in my control, then I try and do the best job possible, and that that has gone very well so far. We've done some interesting work with some interesting people, and that's really rewarding.
Yeah, and you've used lockdown to start your podcast.
Yes, me and everyone else, I think.
Yeah, there have been quite a few.
Yeah.
But yours is about crisis.
Yes.
And how you manage crisis. And what made you want to focus on that aspect? Or?
Well, I think because of what because of what happened, and also because of my the sort of prehistory, if you like, I've always been in and around crisis. So most of my professional life, I was a sort of crisis volunteer, right? And then I found myself as a conscript. And as in the volunteer years, if you like, in newspapers, particularly when I was on the Sun, it's a daily crisis, right? You're chasing towards a deadline, and it is in effect a sort of professional daily crisis. Obviously, on a weekly basis, once you move to a Sunday newspaper, and then in politics, it's a sort of hourly, event. I've always sort of slightly prided myself on being able to handle a crisis well, and to sort of think clearly and stay strategic, which is the absolute key when you're in a crisis, to be able to judge the difference between tactics and strategy, and to kind of try and knock the path clear of the tactical problems so that you stay strategic. That's essentially my job in politics. Spent a lot of time when I was in prison, and in that process talking to other people who were involved to one extent or another in something similar, and I was really interested in how people's approach. And so I just thought, with lockdown, I'd saved myself a whole load of commuting time. I live down in Kent. I thought, well, I'm not going to waste that time. Let's put it to use. And so I just started talking to people about crisis, and we've had some really interesting people on. The danger with podcasting actually is that you don't let it take over your life, because it's such a lovely thing to do, and it's such an interesting thing to do, but that's not my day job. My day job is the business, and that's what I'm focused on. And I've got proper responsibilities there now with the team that we're building, and most importantly with the clients that we're looking after. So no, I'm focused on that. But this is there are many positives from COVID. It's been a wretched situation, a tragic situation for so many people. But if there's one little positive for me, is it's given me the time to be able to do that. Yeah. And the time to spend a bit more time with the family, which has also been a big plus. That
is a big plus. Well, obviously, COVID is a massive crisis for everyone, and particularly the government. And do you think you and David would have dealt with it differently if you'd been at number 10?
Honestly, I think armchair advisor is the easiest job in the world. That's the first thing I should say. No, I can't say that at all. Look, I think it is unprecedented. As we all know, it's a considerably more complex, difficult communications problem than I ever had to deal with. Not to hark back to when I was in the job, but the thing that I did have a passionate belief around was the power of national interest. A fairly obvious thing to say. And when you're able to harness the national interest in politics, you really get momentum. And we managed to do that a couple of times during my period. In fact, we turned the coalition into, at least for the first 6 months or so, into a success on that basis. It felt like a national effort. And although there has obviously been a lot of kind of national effort spirit around this crisis, quite rightly anchored around the NHS, my view is that you've got to have some of that around the centre as well. And that doesn't mean that people need to go out and start clapping for Boriss. That obviously is not going to happen and shouldn't happen. But there does need to be a sort of bit of spirit around what the government are trying to achieve. And somehow that's just not happened. And I
think it happened initially.
It happened initially.
There was a lot of sympathy when Boriss himself was ill.
Certainly. And it may be that Boris's illness is one of the reasons why there isn't enough of it right now, because that in the end is on the leader's shoulders. You've got to be out, living, breathing, kind of fighting for that every day. But I sense that there is definitely a sort of a lack of grip.
We saw recently, the whole Dominic Cummings thing, and without going into a great deal of detail about that, he obviously became the story for a bit. So he didn't do what you did, which was resign when he became the kind of centre or the distraction. I mean, do you think it would have been a bit better if he had?
I don't know. Look, in the end, it's the decisions. In his case, it's a two-person situation. It's him and the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister clearly didn't want him to resign. Yeah. Well, once the Prime Minister tells you he doesn't want you to resign, then it's a one-person decision. You've got to decide how you feel about it. I'm a resigning recidivist, as you know. So, my view was I can't do this job, so I need to resign. Dominic obviously took a different view. And
what do you think about this move to a kind of more US style of politics, to actually have a spokesperson fielding the questions?
It's high risk. We looked at it in 2010, funnily enough. I remember a conversation with David where we wondered whether or not that might be a good idea, but we decided in the end that it's a hiding than nothing. And also, I think just looks a bit grand. It's different now because we're in a crisis. And, if you want to try and find a way of getting a grip, it's definitely an idea. But my God, what a challenge, because you're going to have to second guess across so many departments.
I assumed that the reason that was being done was to kind of put a barrier in, to say that there's a barrier before you get to a politician.
But it's only
closing it down rather than opening it up.
But it's only a barrier if it's useful, right? It will only be a barrier if it can hold back the time. I think that's a terribly difficult thing to do at the moment. There are so many different stakeholders, so many different agendas, so many different people now. The thing's just leaking on such an epic scale that it's going to be very difficult then to kind of pull it back together. But it could be possible. And if you're able to use that device to say, these are the facts and everything else is noise, that would be a massive achievement.
And the future for you is back to very much the day job, a bit less of podcasting, more of looking after
No,
clients?
the podcasting is pretty efficient actually. It's one conversation a week,
Right.
so we're definitely going to keep that going. But yeah, the day job is the main focus, and my clients are dealing with the same challenges as everyone else is. You know, how do you grow? How do you move forward at a time of such uncertainty? That's essentially my job is to try and advise on that and help people kind of stay positive and move forward. And it's as I said earlier, it's fascinating work, but certainty is the thing, right? That's what everybody
We've got
wants.
Brexit coming up,
and there's no sight of certainty for quite some time.
No, indeed. Andy Coulson, thank you very much. You've been a super guest.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's been great. Thank you.
The Mishcon Academy Digital Sessions. To access advice for businesses that is regularly updated, please visit mishcon.com.